Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report with me sounding like I'm under the weather again. I did finally succumb after 2.5 years, at least as far as I know, but here we are. I will not stop this show because of that, and we have quite a bit to cover just over the past week here. A lot of news out of Ukraine, a lot of news out of the Middle East in particular, and some more East Asian news. I know that usually gets swept to the side because it usually gets overshadowed by something more important either in Europe or in the Middle East or America. Now, there's plenty of news about all three of those as well. But just starting with Syria to return to form, the Syrian government has requested the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the so called Syrian Democratic Forces, which is effectively the nice name for the Kurds that they call them so they can get around those PPKK YPG sanctions.
Mhm.
They have demanded that they hand over their portion of the M4 highway, and this came from Russia bolstering the Syrian government's request for this. And this would be the highway in the northeast. I'm sure you all know that's been disputed for control for years now, and it's the one that is a direct shot to Damascus. Now, I'm sure it will surprise none of you that the SDF has refused the request and has refused to withdraw. And this is really to be expected. The SDF, the Kurds, want to hold out for as long as they can. And I assumed once they saw the reality of what's happening with American power around the world, especially in Ukraine, especially in Europe, that they would be more amicable to negotiations with Russia and with Syria. But it seems like they have left themselves two choices and they've chosen the infinitely worse choice. Because the first choice was they could sit down with the Syrian government and have a voice through them, try to work with them through negotiations.
Mhm.
Now, what we have is an SDF without a foreign sponsor because the U.S. has more or less withdrawn from Syria. Not entirely, but Syria is one of its lower priorities at this point. Nobody in Europe, especially given the current crises in Europe, is going to shell out for the SDF diplomatically or financially at this time. So they could have had a voice via the Syrian government in order to work things out. But now what has been determined is they're going to be completely bypassed when it comes to the negotiating table. It's going to be Russia, it's going to be Turkey, it's going to be Iran, it's going to be the Syrian government. It's probably going to be some representatives from the Arab League, probably some representatives from the Gulf states. So, out of all the players on the ground, they have voluntarily robbed themselves of a voice at what is likely going to be the upcoming peace conferences in order to finally set Syria straight, in order to finally bring a state of semi peace to the country now that the American empire is both retracted and distracted elsewhere. And we've been seeing the machinations of this in Syria for the past few months. As soon as the war effort in Syria went pretty healthily towards Russia, because I'm not one of those people who thought, oh, Russia was going to lose, oh, Russia screwed up at the beginning of the war. But when it was less clear at the beginning of the war, in the opening months of the war, Syria's fate was also uncertain as a result. But once the war became more decidedly a Russian success and more decidedly something that's going to end in Russia's favor, it gave them more room to operate within Syria, of course, which will probably lead to some sort of semi peace agreement. Now, with that being said, there were some disputes between the Syrian military and Turkey uh, because there was a actual proper Turkish military, not a Turkish backed group, not a Turkish proxy group, attack from Turkish forces on Syrian forces in Aleppo. And this was a process that actually, as I'm sure you know, goes back several years. But this is part of an overarching dispute in particular that's been going on for a good 3 months now. And this is a result, well, within these past 3 months, there was a statement issued by the Syrian Arab Army, particularly April 27th, if you look at South Front, saying that they are ready to repel any acts of aggression done by Turkey or its proxies on Syrian soil. So Turkey is seems determined to poke and prod what it can at Syria for the time being, and I would say that is mostly the safe face. We talked about the massive offensive that's supposed to be coming. Now, it was a skirmish. This attack was a skirmish, so it wasn't part of the so-called massive offensive that is going to be happening anytime soon. But if I had to, again, give an honest take on it, it seems like Turkey's doing these things as a so-called preliminary to say that we're preparing for a massive offensive. Look, we're keeping the Syrians back. We're keeping them on their toes. So then we can sweep in, accomplish whatever arbitrary goal, go home and declare victory, which is what I believe Erdogan has wanted to do in Syria for quite some time. He just needs the right opening and something he can take home to the people and say, this is a victory. This is why the entire fiasco in Syria was worth it, which is the real dilemma of the Turkish presence in Syria right now. It is a bit of a sunk cost thing where they have been in there almost as long as the Iranians have at this point, and when it comes to the anti-Syrian side, they have probably been consistently and for the longest amount of time the chief force in that. They were used to smuggling a lot of the weapons. A lot of aid was given to them to distribute to various so-called moderate rebel groups. Of course, a similar thing was done with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the Gulf states, where the aid may have came from Washington, may have came from Brussels, may have came from Paris or London or wherever, one of these much more wealthy, powerful countries, but then delegating the task of actually distributing the aid and actually distributing who gets supported to these more regional players, which is part of the reason why Syria was such a mess in the first place. So you have Turkey, who has been at the forefront of that for the past 11 years. Well, they need an out. They need something that they can bring home and say this operation was worth it. This is why we lost however many men. This is why we spent however much money. And this is why we have been in there stoking the flames so long. Because it got this, this, and this out of it. So once again, that is a situation in Syria where, although I still do completely hold to the last summer of Idlib, and I do think we will see that in the coming month and a half, while I do hold to that, I do also firmly hold to the fact that Syria will be solved in a diplomatic matter. That military
Mm.
action in Syria at this point can only go so far because so many of the lines have been solidly drawn that nobody's going to dislodge each other, and that this can really only be solved in a bargaining table.
Yeah, and there is, I mean, the Great Turkish Offensive in many ways has still not started, and it's been over a month now, just a little bit. Uh, the SDF have suffered losses, mainly from drone attacks by the Turks. However, two officers and four Turkish soldiers. So these aren't even proxies. These are Turkish official Turkish troops, combatants, what have you, who were killed by Kurds in Iraq on the border. So um, I don't know if has to do with negotiating. I don't know if this has to do with where Turkey is, its resources, where its attention is being pulled in other areas. But you know, back in early June, when Erdogan said that there was going to be an offensive, and then it simmered down, and then it got mentioned a week later, and then it kind of just disappeared. Maybe this was for domestic politics, you know. Um, but I agree with you that they do want a solution uh, in Syria. And maybe the most interesting comment that Erdogan recently said was he believes that the only way this can happen is if the U.S. leaves Syria. Now, the U.S. in Syria has again uh, taken more wheat and more oil this week from Syria and transported it over to Iraq. No doubt to placate the populations there that are sympathetic to it. which would I assume would be the Kurds, but also to a mixed degree the Sunnis, because of course this week, the last 48 hours, the Sunnis have twice, in the last, I should say, the last 3 days, twice have stormed uh, the Iraqi parliament. And these are Sunnis who are opposed to uh, the Shia who are sympathetic to Iran. Um, I mean, it's a dysfunctional country, right? This for America's efforts, this suits it. May they quarrel forever, and so on. But even the even the Kurds in Iraq, of course, are against any more incursions by the Turks. In Idlib, the various Al Qaeda affiliated groups have started shelling the outskirts. They've even tried to attack Latakia. These are not very sophisticated drones. They were all knocked down. But the point is, they want the Syrian army to go into that area while it's invested in other areas of Syria. And I think that's always been one of the problems is there simply isn't enough ground troops to deal with this. And I mean, central Syria is still dealing with ISIS after all these years. No, they're not the same force that they used to be. They don't have any territory larger than the Al Qaeda affiliated groups in Idlib, which, in fact, even Idlib is bigger than whatever it is that they control. I mean, they've
And more
turned basically,
concentrated.
yes, exactly, right. And Deir ez-Zor in the south, there's been more killings again, but not quite the kind of trouble that we saw in 2021. So, the major population centers are still okay. Damascus, Aleppo, and some of the other bigger towns in between. But if we're talking about the east, the central east, and then the north, those are very unstable regions.
Yes, and it generally tracks. Now I know there are some exceptions that the areas that were loyal to the government during the war are the stable and peaceful ones, and the ones that
Yeah.
they've finally were able to get control over. Now I won't say Aleppo is a paradigm of stability or anything, but compared to the rest of Syria, especially the rest of northern Syria, I
Oh,
would
yeah.
say it's one of the better examples. And then one of the last pieces of news we have out of Syria is that Israel has finally admitted that Syrian S 300s back in May did fire upon one of their jets. So this was Gantz coming out, and of course the cope was our jets weren't even in the area, and the S 300s decided to shoot at them at random, of course, but this was
Yeah.
naturally following a strike on particularly Iranian backed groups in northern Syria once again. And it was the biggest non admission there was. So, just to read the exact quotes from Gantz's interview. Quote, it was a one off instance, Gantz told a conference host by Channel 13 asked to confirm. The Russian launch, and that's in reference to the S 300 being a Russian system, happened when the aircraft were, quote, no longer around, unquote, he said. And then also adding, our jets weren't even in the area, Gantz added, confirming the original report which claimed the S 300 radar did not lock onto Israeli fighters which were leaving the area and thus did not pose a serious threat to the pilots. So
Yeah, I mean, that's cool.
it is, and Gantz also said that Israel's coordination with Russia is in a situation that is stable right now. Of course, this is after the squandering of Russian-Israeli relations by Lapid and Gantz over the issue of Ukraine. And actually, Netanyahu did make some comments about that, saying that Lapid and Gantz need to shut their mouths when it comes to Russia because they are ruining his good work of building a good relationship with the Russians. So Netanyahu somehow coming out and sounding like the sane one after years he was the I mean, how many years did we spend on the show dedicated to talking about how unhinged Netanyahu always sounded? Now,
Yeah.
granted, he was always on the brink of an election and a trial, which it seems like The trial has actually not panned out. The corruption that he was allegedly supposed to be gotten for, uh, as happens with people like him, just seems to have disappeared. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but it doesn't seem like anything serious ever came from that. And with
I mean, I haven't heard anything.
I haven't heard anything. If any of you have, of course, I would love to know, but I haven't seen a thing about that story where it's been more or less swept under the rug that the Likud corruption, which I don't doubt exists. I'm not here to defend Netanyahu or Likud or anything, but it seems like it became a non-issue very quickly, which does tend to happen with these things, especially when you run on prosecuting your political opponents. I mean, one may think of Trump's comments on Hillary. Now, what's happening to Trump right now with the whole J6 thing is a bit of an exception, but also so is everything but Donald Trump's political career. Don't get me wrong with that. And Israel also has said they had Lapid and his people come out and say that Russia's closure of Jewish agencies does dampen relations between the two countries, and that's actually when Netanyahu came out and told them to shut up and that they weren't helping the situation. So Israel, despite receiving these organizations, is disappointed with Russia for the what is effectively the closure of these organizations, which I mean isn't a surprise. They're closing out outposts of influence in the country, and it is a general direction. I think even if Netanyahu were to take power, he wouldn't be able to rebuild the kind of relationship Israel and Russia had for the past several years very quickly, if at all. I think a lot of things have changed. I think that holds true to a lot of people in Western or Western adjacent countries that built a quasi working relationship with Russia. I mean, one may think of Merkel's example of that. If you want to be really out there, if you want to really stretch that definition, you could say Trump. But so much has changed with the situation with Russia now that these tentatively working relationships, in all likelihood, cannot be rebuilt unless
Hmm.
there is some sort of major change, which does have to come from the Western side at this point.
Yeah, I mean, to that, I would say that I don't think there will be one. I can't see it now, and the reason I can't is you just have to read someone like Anne Applebaum or Max Boot or even someone like Lindsey Graham. I mean, I could name another 10, right? And all you have to do was just follow the actions of the U.S. All through December and January and most of February when Russia was trying to get some kind of an agreement where their security interests would be met. And you know that this war basically, it doesn't matter that the media is not covering it, right? Like the Ukraine theater is just one area of the war, as I often say. Um, but this war is like for them, literally Armageddon for the neoliberal order. Uh, they firmly believe that if they lose this, they lose everything, that they're going to lose uh, credibility. And I would say you could add to that that credibility was always something on the line, and that the great example, the recent example that we have, of course, is Afghanistan last year. But if we're going to talk about credibility in 2022, then we're also talking about Taiwan. And with Taiwan, it's not just credibility. We're talking about half the manufacturing of microchips throughout the world. So there's more at stake, and I just think I like even if this goes quiet, I can't see them giving up. Um, it would have to be like a media tour de force to create a narrative why Americans shouldn't care about everything that's going on in the world. And now they could manage something like that, and a lot of Americans would gladly accept it. but I do think that what they're most afraid of would come to pass, and that is, even if they manage to shift the narrative and people are distracted, the feeling that the empire is weak would still be there, and it would get tested again because the knives will be out. If anything, I think what we're seeing is, you're seeing the rest of the world really try to figure out an alternative to the U.S. institutions. Like take SWIFT, for instance. Um, there isn't a SWIFT, but there's one in the making, and there are procedures that have been developed, like the Russian Mir card. Mexico has accepted it, for instance. Lots of countries are now accepting it. We mentioned Turkey and Egypt and India and China and so on. So the efforts are there, and they know that they won't stop. That is, the U.S. knows the rest of the world is not going to stop. And as I often think, like, how willing are they to let this direction go, where they become more and more insignificant? I don't see it, and that's what makes me fearful for the future.
Yes, and with that being said, getting into the question of separations and divorces on a civilizational scale, if you would want to, returning back to, and once again, I think what you said is very, it, it puts a bow on it very nice. I think it explains the situation why these things will not be repaired or healed anytime in the near future or even the foreseeable future for that matter. And getting into that, which is tangentially related, is Orban's inner circle had a resignation this week. So I'm probably going to butcher this, but this is Zsuzsa Hugis, who has been with Orban for 20 years, throughout more or less his entire political career of any significance, resigned because of the statements that he made that we discussed on the show last week about Hungarians becoming a mixed people and about Hungary losing its identity over what is called pure Nazi text. Now, I
Ah,
think it's no secret to us or our audience or anyone who's followed these circles for any significant amount of time that a lot of the populists and nationalists, especially in Europe, have had a very strange relationship with, uh, say, more Zionistic groups or Jewish groups, and it's for obvious reasons. It is supposed to serve as something of a funnel. Now, many would go as far as to say that these people should be written off because of it. They're completely controlled, blah blah blah. I've always liked to think that I've taken a more nuanced view where is while that level of influence may be there, there are still good things that can be done through these people and through these groups. And I think we're starting to see the reason why that might be more true than not. Not to, of course, talk myself up too much. Seeing the resignation of what is fundamentally a Zionist handler on somebody like Orban over a speech that was quote unquote pure Nazi text, as he wanted to call it, where whether it is something that was created as a funnel or something that was infiltrated to become a funnel, that
yeah.
there is, at least in some parts of the world, I would probably discount American federal politics from this, and even pretty much the Anglosphere when it comes to working through a national level politics. I would discount that. Quite a bit of Western Europe too. I think France and Germany might be boned in that case, despite election results by somebody like a Le Pen or like an AFD. Now, I could be wrong, but I think, especially in France's case, the only way that can solve that is a bit more forceful option. Of course, not that I would ever advocate the violent overthrow of any governments at all. I would never, except the ones that our good YouTube overlords need us to. So let's see, that'd be Russia, Iran, etc. You know, just trying to stay above board here, trying to really conform to the narrative, as we are known to do. But with that out of the way, I think it shows that in several parts of the world, especially in continental Europe, there is room for entryism. There is room for people who have more illiberal ideas. And again, that was another phrase that was used on this denunciation ramble about Orban being illiberal, as if this is the first instance of it doing so. But the reason I do bring this up is I believe, especially with Lapid coming to power and the more centrist coalition in Israel with the Likud party and Netanyahu sort of being put to the side now. They could make a comeback. There is, of course, that election coming up in November. Time will tell there. With the agencies leaving Russia and going to Israel, with several prominent individuals leaving the country of Russia, going to places like Israel and places in the West, it does seem to be, and I imagine we'll see this more in Western Europe with parties like the AFD, with parties like National Rally or any of the other quote unquote populist right wing parties. There seems to be a bit of a divestment from their point of view that they've put so much into it. They've decided this is going to be the new funnel, that they're going to have an approved version of populism and nationalism that, of course, we still have quite a bit of say over. The Yoram Hazoni types, the national conservative types, it does
Mhm.
seem like, while I don't think they're going to disappear anytime soon, there is a significant level of divestment happening because they realize these movements cannot be as controlled and influenced as easy as, say, a normal conservative movement or a centrist liberal movement or even a left wing movement at that rate. Even even like I think they'd have better luck infiltrating some of the green parties in Europe if we're being honest when it comes to furthering their own interests. But I maybe this is just me being too optimistic, which I know is something that I try not to do on the show. But perhaps this is the first step of a divestment from European and Western right wing politics. The idea that they can, of course, just hitch their wagon to the newest thing and hitch their wagon to something else that's successful. Or maybe it's precisely because Orban is successful is the reason they have to cut him off. Maybe these are supposed to be groups of
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. That's
perpetual
why.
opposition, which I do fully believe that they do intend for a lot of these parties to be perpetual opposition, and that their success, especially when we saw in 2018, 2019, when you had a string of successes on their part, was a bit of a fluke. It was something that was not supposed to happen. It was actually going off script, going off narrative. So I would say, and Orban is the most successful person and has the most successful political party of this crop of, say, what, the past 5 years, starting with Brexit and Trump going all the way through when it comes to at least Western politics. So I think at the end of the day, they realize they need to cut him off before the monster grows too big. Now, I think it's a bit too late for that now. I think any attempts at trying to rein this in and cut him off and say he's gone too far this time, from their point of view, that probably should have happened a good 2 or 3 years ago, but they sat on it for far too long because I think they thought they could either milk something just a little bit more out of it, or they were blinded by the success of their own project. Maybe they started to take things too seriously, forgot that they were supposed to be a perpetual opposition. But it is an interesting shift, especially with Orban having been the target of really a lot of criticism from his right, and even the right wing parties in Hungary have done this for being too conciliatory with these people, for being too conciliatory with Zionist interests or whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two important lessons to take away from this. And one is the most obvious one is wow, when you get stronger, you can do more bold things. And you can cut ties with persons or groups with which you had previously, and people who uh either from the left or the right made an evaluation of you. Their evaluation will have to change because, as I've often said on this show, it all depends on like whose institutions you're talking about, and it depends on how strong the country was when they joined, right? Like, because of the war, we've been talking often about Russia. So the excuse that the West has always had for the expansion of NATO is that, well, it's a defensive agreement, dummy. We don't, attack anybody except, there's Libya and Yugoslavia and not all of NATO, but many components of NATO participating in Iraq. And so we know that's not true, but why was there a need to expand NATO when Russia was weak? Because Russia was very weak in all of the 90s and part of the early 2000s. It even asked to be part of NATO, right? But for NATO, Russia intact could never be in NATO. It had to be broken first, both metaphorically and literally. It had to be balkanized, and so that's why it couldn't be in there. And so Russia, it was not living. It was living in someone else's world, and it had to go along. It had to keep a policy, and in the very same way, that is what Orban has had to do. But when push comes to shove, and he's seeing that the country, even under this immense pressure, because you have to understand, right? Like this is even this war presents even more opportunities for the EU to steamroll over a country like Hungary. They're already doing a good job in Poland, but to do the same to Hungary, and it's only because of his resilience that is not happening. And now he's showing that he's confident, so he can say statements that, like, quite literally, nobody. I cannot remember the last time a leader of any European nation, has said something like that in decades upon decades upon decades, right? uh I think I might have to go to the 70s or something, quite honestly, and I was like a little kid then. So um you know the gravity of what he's saying is very real, and I'm not surprised that someone in his cabinet or advisors who happen to be Jewish are leaving, right? They have to leave, and he knows perfectly well, by making these statements, they're going to leave. There's no surprise there. We should also consider that. So the first lesson is, when you get stronger, there are certain things you can do, and you can leave this organization now. You're stronger, right? That's important, right? Do you think when Putin launched the war, like, oh my God, what if the WEF kicks me out? Like as if Russia really cared, you know? I still haven't seen one meeting where he attended. Like, it seems like his status was something like, honorary member before, like when he was still, like, I don't know, in St. Petersburg, when he wasn't even like a politician.
Just a membership credential that you need to get anywhere in the
Yeah,
so-called New World Order, and participation optional.
yeah, and you can see that this is a kind of a cute tard strategy. Like, they'll pump up the WEF, but they ignore the IMF, which is like, it's, big sister like, the IMF has been around for ages. I mean, that's the real organization. Like,
Yeah, I
or the
mean,
Council on Foreign
pardon.
Relations. I
Yeah,
mean, that's like, it is a shell game, and people just fall for these shell games. All to say, again, when you become stronger, you don't have to play these games anymore. You can leave these organizations, and you can begin to forge your own path. But the
yes.
other, the other lesson, um, from this is, as you were saying, this strange relationship between, Zionist groups and nationalist groups. I mean, obviously the Zionist groups are there so that nationalist groups in non-Jewish countries never become actually nationalists. They can become, it's a bit of an oxymoron, civic nationalists, but they cannot become ethnic nationalists or racial nationalists, right? That can't happen. Or religious nationalists, right? So it has to be civic, it has to be secular, and that's their role. That's just to make sure that they don't go beyond a certain line. And Orban, as I said before, was very well aware that making those comments, he would receive enormous uh, approval, and that um, anyone who still had illusions that they could still manage this thing, well, he's got a better deck of cards right now. He's got a better hand. And so I have no doubt they had to leave. I mean, if they stay, it would be like, the head rabbi in Moscow still staying. They can't. They can't. They're at cross purposes. They the vast majority of his congregation want Ukraine to win. They want Russia out of Ukraine. They want to transform Russia. Well, that's not going to happen. And so he has to leave, right? Because he's at cross purposes here. And that's why you had all those dozens upon dozens of oligarchs who flew to Tel Aviv back in the first or second week of March, right? Because they're at cross purposes. They know that they cannot let go of this. They had their political agendas, and now they can't have them anymore. Just a very, very interesting development, right?
Yes, and touching on what you were saying with the WEF and the IMF. Now, pardon my language when it comes to this, but the World Economic Forum, as I would say, exemplified mostly by Klaus Schwab, who, don't get me wrong, I do believe is a very bad man who has very bad intentions, but mostly the role the WEF serves is a form of what can best be called mental masturbation. These people love to get
Yeah.
together and they love to think of these pie in the sky ideas about
They're
here's how.
strategists. They're think
Oh,
tanks.
yes, yes. And then touching on what you were
The real
saying,
money's with the IMF.
yes, I was just about to get to that. Touching on what you were saying, the IMF, they're the ones who are trapping nations in debt. They're the ones
Yep.
who are coming to collect when said debt cannot be paid. They're the ones who are making these uh, deal with the devil sort of things. For example, when they approached Belarus and said, "Oh, if you conform with all these X, Y, and Z lockdown standards, we will give you a loan." And of course, when they don't, all of a sudden there's a color revolution on the doorstep. That's who the IMF is. They
Hmm.
are the
Hmm.
ones with the real power behind this, the ones with the real strength behind this. The WEF is just, once again, their form of mental masturbation where they can go out there and they can quasi mock us by plotting to do all these really pie in the sky things, but the WEF, I think just because they've gotten so brazen, especially with somebody like a Schwab, that is why they have garnered so much attention. And not to mention, as I just said, as you just said, they're good for taking heat off of people like the IMF, who are the ones doing the real damage.
Right, right. That's where the power is centered, and getting rid of the WF isn't going to change anything, right? Like the WF wasn't even like I understood it. I understand it existed in the '90s as an organization, but believe me, it only hit like the last 3, 4 years as like a relevant organization. But like we're here not because of them. Like we're here because of their sister organizations and their parental, if you will, organizations. So yeah, I also think the like COVID in many ways broke a lot of people. Like on the one hand, like even in Toronto, I will still see the odd person who is walking downtown with a mask. I mean, there are a lot of people with masks, don't get me wrong. But on top of the mask, they're also wearing a face shield,
Oh,
right?
that's a relic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm like that's how far they are. And but the other way of that people have been broken is a lot of these organizations, which no one knew before COVID, very few people paid attention to them. Suddenly they're catapulted. And as you say, quite rightly, they have shifted the attention away, right? But there was better criticism and discourse about like where the regime's power lay and which organizations were responsible a bit before it. And you're right, it's distracted people away from them. Um, I also think that these organizations, like their purpose is, it's literally there to blackpill people, um, like telling them, you're going to be a minority by 2030. I mean, yeah, it will probably happen, but to be told that every day is also setting the conditions for it, and it's also to just completely demoralize people, right? A lot of like what the WEF says or when it looks like COVID might come back, is the primary purpose is that people are completely demoralized. Like I mean, there's real action that manifests from that, right? That I don't want to downplay that, but when you look at how many times since the war got started where I hear about another variant and things look like they might pick up again and then they die down, you can see that they're not quite sure when the opportunity will come about. But that whole process is there to demoralize people. Now, I don't know what's going to happen if they ever go for lockdowns again, and how well tolerated these lockdowns will be. But as we were saying this last year, that this is one of the functions of the mandates and the restrictions was a friend enemy distinction exercise. And we always said that's because the real emergency is coming. And I mean, I didn't think a war was coming. I thought more economic woes, possibility of a war, but mostly just a more strained society, more polarized and poorer, and
And of
that
course, less
these
functional.
and less functional, and that these measures would be necessary because we will probably have like another BLM summer in the not too distant future. And so that's where my mind was going. But then when the war broke out, I mean, you saw how quickly they got, they abandoned the COVID narrative. And I was saying back in December and January, I believe, that that they're going to see a correlation. Sorry, I said it in February. They're going to look for a correlation between people who were against the jab or the restrictions, on some level had a mistrust of the official governmental narrative, the institutional and media narrative around COVID, and it's all its multiplicity, okay? And that they were going to see this correlation of people who didn't jump on the Ukraine bandwagon, and the greatest, the most fruitful group from where this uh, uh, group that would reject the narrative or question the narrative around Ukraine would come out of those people who didn't take the jab or who were against it or regretted it, or it would come from that crowd. And that's what happened. And I remember listening to an AA stream, and he literally started talking about that. And I
Yeah,
think it
so
was
I was
that.
actually just about to bring that up. He went through and meticulously put together the
Yeah,
overlap of said groups and how it correlates with each other. So,
yeah. And
you
but
beat me to
it's
it there.
interesting. We were talking about that they would be looking for that, and then the UK and Canada came up with their own figures.
Yeah, that was once again I I know as absurd as it sounds, there's people who listen to us. Orban listens to us, Macron listens to us, Putin
Putin.
listens to us. The entire Canadian and British establishments listen to us. You see, we are important. We are a hinge on which the entire geopolitical world turns. Now, with the self praise out of the way, we do have some news about Europe and about the current ongoing energy crisis there.
Oh
So,
yeah.
probably the most telling or the most visually representing incident of what is happening in Europe right now is there was a meeting between Baerbock, who is the German foreign minister, meeting with her Greek counterpart, and during the meeting, the lights went out. There was a power surge. Now, I get it. Power surges happen. It's just something that's part of technology. It's never foolproof. But that is a power surge on top of an ongoing energy crisis that is particularly hitting Germany harder than I would say just about any nation in the world right now when it comes to this energy crisis. And with that, you're already seeing the restrictions go into place, there was news out of Hanover, which, of course, one of the major cities in Germany. They cut off their hot water because of the availability of gas. So, once again, that goes back to the natural gas in particular, where we've talked about this. We said it's not just going to be a crisis come winter. Winter is going to exacerbate it because that's when people use the most heat. That's when people use the most energy because they need to heat their homes. However, in the event of an unusually hot summer, which it seems like we're in the middle of one right now, especially for the Europeans, or just in order to keep industry in general going, there is going to be an energy crisis over that, and there's going to be shortages over that. And perhaps the one thing even I overlooked was the luxuries of industrial society, of first world industrial society, are also going to take a hit. For example, hot water like this. And this is, of course, in an attempt to cut energy use by a whopping 15%. So they are trying to downgrade this by 15%. And that is while also reactivating 3 nuclear plants. However, there was an interesting story focusing primarily on the US, but I can only imagine applies just as much, if not more, to Germany, about how the vast majority of uranium that is used for their nuclear power comes from, you guessed it, Russia. And when it comes to the technology to maintain these plants, well, of course, the US does have a stronger domestic nuclear energy base, at least stronger than what Germany has. Not that Germany doesn't have any of it. Once again, puts you in the trap of being more dependent on Russia. That was one of the things that kept getting brought up when, of course, coal plants were reactivated, and of course they're still in the process of doing that, in which case that still does take time because those were decommissioned as well. So you have the reactivation of both coal and nuclear plants. And it is interesting because a lot of people thought nuclear would be a way to escape energy dependence on Russia when it came to oil, coal, and natural gas, all of which Russia is the major provider for. But then it turns out that Russia also has the nuclear market dominated. So it seems at this point, just looking at it objectively, correct me if I'm wrong, unless you want to pour a fortune into something like solar or wind, which are much less efficient energy sources, that if you live in Europe, if you live in Germany in particular, you're reliant on Russia for energy. If you want to maintain yourself as an industrialized society for the time being, you are reliant on Russia in some way, shape, or form. Now, you could say perhaps the nuclear is less reliant because there, of course, there are other places you can get uranium. There's other ways, in other countries, including Germany itself, that manufacture said nuclear technology. But when it comes to oil and gas, which are still the 2 biggest sources of energy and the 2 most efficient sources of energy, it's coming from Russia. The U.S. does not have the infrastructure, nor at this point does it produce the capacity in order to ship it to Europe in any scale that can sustain Germany's economy, or let alone the entirety of Europe's economy as well. So we're in the middle of this ongoing squeeze. The situation only gets worse in Germany. I know it's anecdotal, but some of the Germans I know online, I've been seeing less of them. It's like, have you been forced to ration power this soon? I don't know, or maybe life dictates in the middle of an energy crisis that you don't have time to sit around shit posting, which is a real shame because it may not sound like it, but German shit posters, when you can actually find one, are fantastic. They
Yeah.
they are masters of their craft. But I'm getting too far off topic with that. But I mean, of course, this is a crisis that will continue to reverberate throughout the entirety of Europe, as Germany is the industrial engine of Europe. Even if a country uh, like Hungary, for example, has not ceased trade with Russia, has actually increased energy trade with Russia, is still going to suffer as a result of Germany being the economic engine of Europe as a whole and the European Union in particular. And it can only be described at this point, the only way I can look at this is a plan to cripple an entire continent. This is nothing new on the show. This is nothing that's a unique take as far as we're concerned. We've been saying this over and over, but I think it's becoming harder and harder for anyone to deny that what is at play here in Europe is that they are trying to bring Europe completely to heel. They're trying to make them completely dependent on the American Empire. And coincidentally, or maybe not, but it just so happens for Europe that it is at the weakest state the American Empire has been in generations, probably since its inception. And they are supposed to turn to them as a source of energy, as a source of all these different things. And that is all combined. Now, this affects Europe much less, but of course, they're not completely spared from this more of a Middle Eastern and African problem. The grain shipments that have been halted out of Russia as a result of this war. So, these just keep piling on top of each other more and more. A lot of people do understandably focus on the food shortages that will be coming out of the Middle East and Africa, but once again, there is a lot of people who are overlooking that Europe is about to be brought to economic heel, that we're about to see a major blow to industrial civilization, which I know that might excite some of the Kaczynski fans out there. Um, but I think reality, when it comes to deindustrialization, might look a lot different than what you were expecting. So, just taking a look at that, I will once again hammer the point home. You're in the golden window if you want to go to Europe. Things aren't unstable yet, but they aren't prosperous where it would be expensive. So I will once again hammer home that unofficial travel advice that if you ever wanted to see any of these great European cities while they're still left, and again, I'd question how much I consider Paris a great European city, but you get the point. Uh,
Yeah.
if you want to go see some German castles, if you want to go to Germany, I get on it right this instant over any other nation in Europe, because things are about to go to hell in a handbasket there. And I may sound excited about that, but I'm actually not. I think it's a travesty what is going to happen to the most populous and the most industrious nation in Europe, and that things are not going to look good. Now, I don't think we're going to get a situation that we saw maybe in the mid 19th century, where several of them tried to emigrate to the United States, especially the United States, because it's not like we're doing much better. But I mean, emigration out of some of these countries, in I wouldn't say a mass sense, but a noticeable sense where people are emigrating out as groups, I don't think is unheard of at this point, especially with the Schengen zone, especially when you can freely transit in Europe. Not that I think many places in Europe are going to have that much of a leg up over Germany when it comes to this upcoming crisis, but I can certainly see people trying to get out of Germany in particular, and Europe as a whole. Now, where they would go, I know that Russia put out a bit of a trolley, immigration ad, say, come move to Russia because we have this, this, and this. And the entire thing was just pretty much making fun of uh, the current state of the West, and of course, you could probably gather by that the kind of people that they're trying to draw in with that. But point being is, I wouldn't be surprised if people in countries like Germany are looking for a way out. Maybe I mean we've already seen in the past 3 or 4 years that scores of Germans are moving to Hungary and setting up shop there and claiming things like it's safer, it's cleaner, it's nicer, and for all we know, it could be they have warm water. Give it the next 2 or 3 years, and even that's a bit of a overstretch. Maybe the next 1 or 2 years. But point being is, I and honestly, out of everything that's happened uh, as a result of this war, as a result of the ongoings of the past year, the state of Germany, every time I talk about it, still leaves me in absolute shock. I didn't I knew it was a nation dependent on the outside, and even by design, especially post World War II. But it's one thing to know it, but to actually see it play out in person, especially to this degree, it does make you wonder how a country like this can be even considered a major player on the world stage when it's that easy to cripple.
Right. And as we said at the, near the start of the war, that much of European wealth was based on cheap Russian gas and economic and manufacturing from China, economic cooperation, trade, and so on with China, right? And those two things are being taken away, and now you're getting a better picture of what its self-reliance actually looks like. And um, you know, even if you go to Britain, petrol prices there are still very high, and you have this now new phenomenon of kids who are doing their homework in McDonald's because they can't afford Wi-Fi at home. Uh,
So when things go wrong, they flee to the American embassies. What you're trying to tell me?
yes. So they're going there because the cost of living, guess what? Even in Britain, which doesn't import a heck of a lot of Russian gas, is also um, becoming very stringent. And um, so they're having to go there in order to finish their homework. So, they'll buy some uh, fries and, maybe something else until they get their homework done. What a sad, sad state of affairs. But uh, as this year is progressing, what we're seeing is countries like Algeria, Saudi Arabia, even Qatar are saying they're at maximum capacity. We can't give you what you want. And Russia is, I mean, whether Russia is intentionally doing this or not, because the latest news is another turbine has to be repaired. And so Russia has reduced capacity to only 20%. Previously, it was only at 40%.
Yes, and
And
just
we
to
know that,
clarify, of course, that is a Nord Stream 1 turbine, and
yes,
based on the maintenance from July 11th to the 22nd, the numbers are still not back up to full capacity from when that was shut down for the first round of maintenance. And that is also on top of, if you want a nice thing to contrast this, Gazprom made a deal with the Iranian-backed energy company, state-backed
yeah,
natural gas company, for $40 billion. So we're
yeah,
seeing the development of that further. I believe what they were calling a north-south corridor in the initial reports. So as Europe begins to falter, particularly Germany, and as you were saying, some of the issues with the UK, as they continue to falter, as they continue to fall into shortage, you have other countries which have not gone along with the sanctions package, such as Iran in particular, and I would say the two biggest examples are probably India and China, continuing to prosper over Europe's even just strong arm decision not to participate in the Russian energy markets.
right. And the whole point of the expansion of the EU in the 90s, was that we were going to incorporate all these other countries into the West, and there was all these lucrative opportunities. Capitalism and liberal democracy could expand one after the other. But the real goal really was to get all the cheap commodities from Russia in order to embolden and enrich the West. And now we're seeing what it's really like without Russia. And Russia now has all the cards. It, up until this time, has not retaliated. It has patiently waited for them to start acting nuts. You're seeing German businessmen asking for Nord Stream 2 to open up. I think they're wasting their time, but they're in a state of desperation, and they do not have enough for the winter. So uh, I don't know how much of this the European public can actually take, and Russia can very easily just continue to only send 20%. Like, you make life more difficult for Russia and Ukraine, Russia can make life more difficult for you. And you're seeing more fracturing. There are now farm protesters taking place. Sorry, not taking place, but joining together and protesting in Italy. I'm not saying any of these movements are actually going to go anywhere, but I see them as a precursor to other things that will probably develop as the situation continues to rapidly deteriorate. So that's what we're really seeing here. We're seeing what Europe's wealth actually looks like. We're seeing just how big of a contribution Russia was. And you can't, like, a lot of people are, gloating and expressing the Schadenfreude over Germany's over reliance on Russian gas. Well, I mean, it's not like Germany is a completely sovereign state, any more than Japan or Italy are, right? Uh, they're coming up with they're striving towards clean energy just like everybody else was. So yes, they shut down the nuclear power plants, and as we mentioned in 2020, at one time Germany, well in the 2000s, was the biggest burner of coal for energy in Europe, right? So they're doing all of this stuff. So on the one hand, they're being pressured by these institutions that we've already discussed, to come up with more green energy solutions, and that's what they're doing. Like, I mean, how much can you really blame them, right? Like it's Chernobyl was a thing; it happened. Fukushima was another one. So yeah, people are kind of afraid, and yes, there is that culture that's very anti-nuclear through Europe, and particularly in Britain, and even more so Germany, right? So um, nobody was faulting them for that, right? What they wanted was like a Russia that was completely malleable and could just. I mean, if Russia was completely malleable, they wouldn't even be complaining, right? But American interests have to supersede all other interests, and if you go against that, well, then you're an immoral person, right? Um, that, like philosophically, there's something very wrong with that, right? Demonstrably, over the last 30 years, when America's had the chance to prove that, it's a shining city on the hill that is the bastion of democracy and so on and so on, it has relinquished that through its own actions. It has demanded an exception to the rule every single time. And people still make moral arguments instead of just saying, okay, this principle is very important. I mean, our audience knows we don't really give a shit about democracy, but I'm arguing from their point of view that if that's the case, then let the ideal rule, right? Instead of like expecting that the ideal can only reside in this or that country. So, anyways, I'm not so harsh on them because I feel like they were partly pressured into doing that anyways. That was a solution that this country, in its circumstances and the history that it has, had to use. I mean, it's not like there's pipelines that are coming over from the US across the Atlantic and can be as reliable and fast and as cheap. There's like options are limited. And there's a lot of gloating over, like, in Europe by some people, over uh, Germany's problems. But, like, it's a cascading effect and process here, right? So, like, Germany's going to suffer economically, but so will you in 3 months. Like, it will eventually catch up with you.
Well, yeah,
And
that's what I was just saying. Even a country like Hungary, which hasn't cut off Russian energy, just because Germany's such an economic titan, just because it's such an industrial titan, that the entire continent will go down with it.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, 2022 has been a hell of a year. And, there's still like 45% of it left to go. And who knows what's going to happen? I mean, we can make some pretty good guesses, but yeah, that's all I'll say for the European situation at the moment.
Well, don't make any guesses because whatever we predict will come true 6 months sooner than we said it would.
Yeah.
As has a tendency to happen with that, but I mean, really, once again, all I can do is co-sign pretty much everything you just said, particularly about Germany and Europe, and that uh, it's gonna be a hell of a time. And honestly, when problems hit the shores of the U.S., which I do believe will happen, but in a much more delayed sense, I'm not sure, honestly, who it's going to be worse for. Now, we've spent, again, how many hours collectively over the past, 6 months, talking about why Europe is going to suffer, why it's going to be a very bad time to live in Europe. But even though the U.S. is more insular, once problems hit there, and I would say purely because of the racial and ethnic tensions, things are going to get a lot worse. And that's something you also can't discount about Europe when it comes to what the past 7 years of mass migration and the cropping up of, say, neighborhoods of all different stripes.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have, I mean, we do too, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, but you guys have the equivalent of a new small city coming in over the southern border every year. Like, just how long can that go on? And you see these kind of duplicitous headlines, no less from the Atlantic, where Trump is demonized for wanting to build the wall, and then Biden is, we are told, is uh, making the courageous choice to finish gaps in the wall. But you know why? Because it's in areas where it's very dangerous for migrants to cross. Like, you're supposed to believe this stuff. It reminds me of Trump is going to get us all killed with his antagonism towards China. But uh, everybody's forgotten that. Meanwhile, like, Pelosi is intentionally, uh, poking the dragon by going to Taiwan. I mean, if anybody's been paying attention to the news in the last 24 hours, so
Oh,
it's
yes, don't worry, we'll be getting to that in a few minutes here.
yeah, yeah. So it all depends on who's doing it.
And the final piece of news I do have out of Europe, which does tie back into the China issue, you did bring it up briefly, but Europe is expected by the US to decouple from China over the next 12 months. Now, keep in mind,
Yep.
this is after how many successive years of at it's December of every year where they'll sign some sort of trade agreement or trade expansion with China. I know both 2020 and 2021 they did this where they expanded trade with China immensely and were many European countries were not direct partakers in the Belt and Road Initiative, but were inching towards that direction. Of course, there was the construction of the railway and highway that went from Hamburg to Shanghai. I think that that one is a few years old, so uh, but I mean, still, it would involve the suspension of projects like that, the suspension of the massive amount of trade that has been going on. I keep in mind the maps from 2020. I don't have them on hand, where it shows from the year 2000 or 2001 the larger trade partner in the world, whether they trade more with U.S. or China. U.S. represented by blue, China naturally by red. Most of the map is blue. You go to 2020, and that was the year that was supposed to cripple China with, of course, conduit coming out of there and everything. And most of the map is red, and most of that map continues to get more red. You look at the maps, which I actually do believe I have on hand, about how Europe is projected to go in the direction of a Trump presidency and a non Trump presidency. So the one on the left, naturally, is the one that they were expected to go under Trump. So dark blue means increased cooperation, light blue maintain cooperation, and the light pink, there is no dark pink. Light pink means divest from the U.S. and look for other options. And then you have the map on the right, which was what was projected to be under a non-Trump presidency, with the color code meaning the same, with the only two notable pink nations being France and Germany. Now, I'd love to see updated maps by the organization to put this out, but point being is you can have this, and you saw this in 2020, you saw this in 2021, where more and more the European Union as a whole and individual European nations continued cooperation and increased trade and ties with China. And now they're expected within 12 months to decouple from China. No given consequence. Now, whether that will result in a threat of sanctions or anything else, really, that naturally was not clarified by the U.S. because they wouldn't come out and be as brazen as to say something like that. But once again, to bring Europe to heel, they want to deprive it of any outside source. They want to turn Europe into what is fully a colony, something fully reliant on the U.S. And once again, this is an American empire that is not up to code. That is not what it once was. Maybe an American empire a decade ago making these sort of demands that you will be solely reliant on us. Now, even then, you still have the energy conundrum because, especially at that point, the U.S. was in no condition to ship energy overseas. And once again, you're at the point where the U.S. is demanding that Europe become a sole subsidiary of them more than it already is by completely cutting off Russia, by completely cutting off China. I mean, at least the Russia thing they had a very ham-fisted excuse for that. Well, they're the aggressors in this conflict. We need to stand with democracy, and we need to stand with Ukraine because the first line between you guys and Moscow domination across the continent was the. I know that was the big Eastern European talking point for several months there, but point being is, they now want to isolate them from China, which is a country that, even under the whole rules based order and international system, they don't really have a case for cutting off. And China, of course, is a country that was propped up by the American Empire, a country that was really brought to prominence by the American Empire. So, dealing with a monster of their own, I guess. But it is probably the most brazen thing I've seen the American foreign policy establishment ask of anyone in the past 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, like I say, this is Armageddon for them, right? Like this is really important. If they don't win this, I think then they know that they're on a kind of a terminal decline, and it's been long in coming, right? Yeah, everybody has seen those maps when America accounted for 80% as the one country that everybody traded with in 2020, and then in 2000, and then in 2020, 75% of the world is trading with China, right? And they have to put a halt to it. I mean, um, all along the way, like you said, a few years ago it was G5, and we can't have that. But this was kind of just window dressing. They had much, much bigger concerns that were developing, and now we're seeing the full force of this effort to change the tide, because I think now they realize that all these countries that are cooperating with Russia are going to continue to do so. You have an article from The Guardian recently that basically says the sanctions are a complete failure. They're hurting Europe. They're going to have very bad consequences. In fact, Russia is doing well. It's not just that the ruble is getting stronger, but inflation is dropping in Russia, including just basic inflation on goods. Prices for goods are actually going down. This is not just for financial services, right? So this is like for the average consumer. And yeah, they're in a real pickle, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I don't really think there's another way beyond pickle to put it. Now, I suppose I'll hand it over for the minutia minute, and you can take us away.
Okay. Our friend on Telegram laughed at the minutia minute. He loves it. Okay, so lots have been going on. Last week, I failed to mention that the Russians may have shot down two of their own jet fighters, one an Su-34 and another Su-35. And the reason it's suspected that it was their own systems is these jets were well into Russian-controlled territory, or even on the border of Russia in the east. The Ukraine has some S-300 systems, but it does not have that many. And there was speculation that maybe this was um, leaving, literally leaving air defense systems on auto. Now, in both circumstances, the pilots ejected. Now, the Su-34 has, of course, two crew members. The Su-35 has one. I haven't heard anything back since then, but I use this story also as a segue into what is happening in Kherson, because this is an area where the S-300 and the S-400, which has newly arrived, has made some news in being able to shoot down HIMAR missiles and HIMAR rockets. However, it seems that the Russians did not engage with them on, I believe, July 26th and 27th, which caused extensive damage to three relatively important, but one very important bridge. So the relatively important bridge is the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson. And then there's the railroad bridge over the dam in Novokakhovna. That one has not sustained huge damage. Supplies are regularly going in to the west side of the Dnieper River, to the that other side of Kherson, and much of the supplies are originating from Crimea. So, but Antonovsky Bridge did have to get closed down. Now they've built some pontoons. Um, Bridges are notoriously difficult to knock down. You basically need mines at the bottom to knock it down, right? Um, but if you create enough holes and it becomes a hazard, then it's effectively neutralized, right?
Yes,
There's
there's much
another
easier ways to decommission it than complete demolition.
right, yes, well put. And there's another bridge, a smaller bridge in the Uglitz River, that apparently has also been damaged. So, I mean, I just saw a rail shipment video from Crimea going into Kherson. So, um, the attempts to take uh, back Kherson are much touted in Western media, particularly the BBC and CNN, but also in Ukrainian media. And all I can say is there's some insignificant amount of territory that has switched hands, both like at least twice. There is no great surge coming in for the city of Kherson. Kherson itself is much smaller than Mariupol. Mariupol was about 420,000 people, and the Severodonetsk and Lugansk, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk conurbation was roughly the same. If you include Rubnoje, which is on the side where Severodonetsk is, it's very close. Like, I mean, we're talking like 10, 15 kilometers away, right? Um, so, anyways, so no great surge yet, but the Ukrainians insist that there will be. And I honestly think that the reason they're doing this is because they need a victory. Even Zelensky has said that if we don't have a victory, a significant victory by autumn, then we're going to be in big trouble, because the U.S. has already made it clear that if there are no victories, then the amount of supplies coming in will be will be reduced. And indeed, for July, the amount of money and supplies that have been flowing into Ukraine have been significantly reduced. And I imagine as the economic situation in Europe deteriorates, fewer countries will be willing to donate. Now, I'm very sad to report that Macedonia has donated 31 T-72s, the T-72A variant, to Ukraine. So our elites are kissing ass to do anything to get into the EU as the EU is crumbling. Another example of
Really
very
trying to
poor
get
decision.
into vulture whatever scraps they can before it all falls apart, I see.
Right, right. And part of it is also the very strong Albanian minority that is determining the direction of politics in Macedonia as well. That plays a key role. It's basically an example of elite capture. Most of the country vastly supports Russia. Definitely, the Slavic part of Macedonia supports Russia overwhelmingly. Albania, the Albanians, very doubtful. They see it as an existential threat because of Serbia. Uh, so they've donated, and there have been, I was surprised to find out, about close to 70 mercs that originated from Macedonia to go fight for Ukraine. Now, my guess is most of them are Albanians, but there's probably some idiot Macedonians that have gone. Some more sad facts that unfortunately I have to report. Now, moving eastward towards Donbass, this is where the battles are very, very heated. And there have been some important but small gains for the Russians. They have, in the north of Donetsk, cut off an area around Seversk, uh, moving closer to Donetsk city. There has been a major push westward. And we're seeing, like, when the war started out, one of the towns that was traded back and forth, people often talk about the airport going back and forth until the rebels finally took the airport and pushed the Ukrainians out of there. The reason this was so important is because it had an underground tunnel that was like a mile and a half long, and they could resupply it without getting hit. So it was really important to seal that off because it allowed bombing Donetsk. And we've seen, you know, for at least 2 months, very intensive bombing uh, of Donetsk city, but other smaller towns in Donetsk and Lugansk as well. However, uh, the the push now, this is under the Bakhmut, Kramatorsk area. It's south of that. It's along the road. And the towns that they're pushing against, I'll start with the first one. This is the one where most of the shelling is coming from, and that's Avdiivka. Next, we have Krasnodarsk, Marinka, and Pesky. Pesky is that town, like when I brought up the example of the airport, that went back and forth. But eventually, the Ukrainians took that, and it's been their town. Now, all of these towns, the Russians are already in. They're not just on the outskirts; they are in some of the streets uh, at the edge of the city, but they're not in the farm field. They're not on the outskirts. They are in the city proper. Um, so that is an important gain because it means that they will have an easier time to shell Bakhmut. And Bakhmut is the central headquarters. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that the Russians hit one of the command posts there that resulted in dozens of well, dead Ukrainians, and also a lot of Polish and Georgian mercenaries. Um, and speaking of units getting wiped out, now this is a Russian report, but a train belonging that was carrying the elite President's Brigade. This is Zelensky's brigade, but I'm assuming this title is for any president of Ukraine. So this is a very well trained force, and it's very well equipped. It's going to have a lot of tanks. Now the Russians claim that they hit this train and 140 dead, possibly 250 injured, and a lot of military material has been destroyed as a result. I'm I would say that there were a lot of large losses probably, and we're probably going to get news. I don't know about those exact figures, and I've mentioned in the show before that hit. Now I don't know if this train was moving, but if it was a moving train, it would be more difficult to hit it. It's all I'm saying, right? But both countries have uh, launchers that are have like an accuracy within like 10 to 15 meters. That's pretty good. So they can hit things pretty accurately. um, the Russians have the Smerch, and they have another one above the Smerch. Of course, the Ukrainians still have some HIMARS, so they're both very accurate. They can do that. But this was an Air Force based missile that hit it. So, anyways, I'm going to assume that there were heavy losses. There's other units that have had heavy losses, including another one in Mykolaiv. That guy Orlovsky, remember him from Vice when the war was going on in 2014
Oh,
and 15?
naturally. You know why I remember him?
Yeah.
Because he was the one who gave the interview that gave this great screenshot.
Oh,
I think you know which one I
oh
have up
man,
right.
you're fast. Oh, that's gold.
Yes, yes, it is. But as you were
I
saying,
don't know if the audience knows. I can't see that. I just know I know how Constantine thinks. I know exactly which one he popped up, but we don't have a screen share when we talk. Like we just know each other.
yes, it's scary.
It really is truly scary. So Mikolaev had another huge hit, and I was very surprised that he reported on it. And he estimates at least 40 soldiers killed. So Ukraine is suffering very heavy losses, much worse than the Russians and the people of the Donbass are. And what has caused uh, Zelensky to recently speak about this area is he's asked families to move out of Donbass. Now, this is rich because many of these families, whether they want to be ruled by the Russians or not, simply cannot afford to rent an apartment for $350, US, I'm guessing, or 350 euros, the equivalent of, and try to find a job, right? So for them, they have to stay where they are. And many of them, of course, are staying because, frankly, they don't want to live under Ukrainian rule. They never have. Um, Especially the way Ukraine changed after 2014. Those changes were already happening before 2014, but 2014 was an accelerant to that kind of exclusive uh, kind of nationalism that rejected them. It didn't just rejected them; it just said, they were evil. So um, I'm guessing that they don't want those people to stay behind and build a future, of whatever is going to be left of that area. Um, we don't know. Uh, Mariupol, for instance, is being rebuilt, but there's a lot of territory that has to be rebuilt. So, I mean, I've just heard arguments about why that is. I personally think that this is them threatening them, like to leave, right? Um, to go slightly, westward. Um, I'm guessing that they're going to go to, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, initially, and that will slow down the Russians in attacking them because if a town is really vacated, then it's more difficult for them to hold on to that town, obviously. Um, Now, going slightly further north in the direction of Donbass towards Gorlovka, there is let me just get my notes here. There is a town called Lugansk. Now, I know it sounds like Lugansk, and it does, but it's actually in Donetsk Republic, and it has like this water well, and there's a power generator there, the Ugledar power plant. Now that was taken a few days ago with not much fighting. There was a retreat that the Ukrainians made, fairly well organized, and so the power plant was not heavily damaged. Uh, and this was not an easy area to take because there's like a tiny lake there, so you could only attack it basically from the south, or you had to kind of curve around in a hook from the north, but you couldn't take it dead on. Um, so those are the gains that are happening there, and I would say further north, the Russians have updated the map. If people want like a really good update where you're going to find out information about various brigades, battalions, detachments, all with names, then check out Military Summary Channel. And the Russians apparently changed a map on the Izium front, and Izium was one of those areas that fell, uh, after long fighting, rather quickly, like Popasnaya. and that's what allowed the encirclement of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. There are two towns that are now considered in the gray zone. They are no longer considered controlled by the Russians. So this is a very well forested area. It is just north of Slavyansk. The Russians have not been able. One of the forest names is actually Sherwood. They have not been able to force their way from the north into Slavyansk, which probably means that the Russians will have to go from the south. Now there is talk that including the Ukrainians, they're saying that there are masses of troops that are developing now on the Russian side of the border of Ukraine, and that they expect some kind of a more bolstered and effective and more numerous front to begin to engage them. Parallel to that is that the Ukrainians are shifting more troops from the center and the west of Ukraine, not just to Donbass, but relieving some of those troops in Donbass and sending them to Kherson, because Kherson is another area that where it seems that the Ukrainians, even though they don't have much to show for it, are determined to build some kind of a force. In my opinion, what they're trying to do is delay an onslaught on Nikolaev as things begin to tighten against them in Donbass. And then lastly, Kraken, which is like one of these subgroups of Azov. There's others like Tornado. These are like smaller detachments. There's also Donbass Battalion. These are like, S14, but it's, in Cyrillic, it's a C. So
Yeah.
it looks like C14. So Kraken suffered a major hit. They lost 30 of their soldiers in the Kharkov area, the Kharkiv area, just a day ago. And that last story wraps up my Minutia Minute, which I'm sure the audience would wish was only a minute, but
I think anyone who still tunes into the show at this point is here particularly for that and not for my ramblings about the European energy crisis. But just a couple of things. One story that did come out of Ukraine is the continuing trend of Russia giving citizenship to territories that it does
Mhm.
intend to integrate. Kharkov was the most recent one. And you did miss the most important story about Ukraine this week, which is Zelensky and
Oh,
his wife had
yes,
the
go on, go
Vogue
on. Yeah.
photo op. Who could forget about that? And um, this is actually amid declining approval abroad for Zelensky and declining faith in the Ukrainian war effort, particularly out of the American public, where something where it's as compared to what it was early on in the war, which was like 80 some percent, which dropped to about a quarter, and now about 2/3 of the American public still believes that the Ukraine war is actually winnable for Ukraine. That's regardless of, again, whether or not they support Ukraine or not, but this is just a poll on it. The
Mhm.
tend will too to be conflated. People who do support Ukraine, of course, believe that some sort of victory is possible, that they are able uh, to repel the Russian invasion, and some really pie in the sky individuals might think that they might even be able to push Ukrainian forces right to the gates of the Kremlin. I'm sure you've seen all of that.
You know what? Next time, the next show, we have to put up those slides from that Ukrainian children's history book.
Oh yes, we do. I was actually just
We
about to say,
have to do it. It's so hilarious. It's just like 7 or 8 slides, but it in fact makes it even funnier.
yeah, and then there's the one that I always want to bring up, but I always forget, where it's from the beginning of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. It's Obama using the stereotypical Ukrainian man with just like the front ponytail thing, whatever that's called, that like
Yeah.
the Cossacks would have, using him as a battering ram, and I think it's Obama shouting Slava Ukraina, and then the Ukrainian guy is shouting you'll probably know this. The Glory the Heroes response that they would
Yeah,
always do
yeah,
in 2014, but it's just
yeah.
Obama using
Slava
him
Gorayim. Yeah, yeah.
as a battering ram against the Kremlin wall. um, and it's an amazing comic. I love it. I love the essence of it. I love everything about it. But yes, we do need to show pictures from that Ukrainian's children's history book, which
It's
will.
I love how they gloss over Volin, the the Volin mask. It just goes to Volin.
Yeah, it just didn't happen. uh, but yeah, that is I don't know the word for it, but that is a true masterpiece in so
Yeah,
many senses of the word.
yeah. It's so innocent. And my favorite is the last page. It's remarkable.
But
Chef's kiss.
yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm going to have to make a concerted effort to bring that on. But on top of that, you have, and maybe that could change the decline in approval rating for Zelensky abroad, and maybe that is just what America and Europe needs to see in order to give them even more HIMARS so they can turn the tide of this war and somehow beat back the Russians, which is what I do believe some people actually believe. But
I
as
know, and I think what kills me is that they did this. They had Annie Leibovitz of all people to shoot this, right? I know, right? I know. What kills me is like they literally took the most emblematic, narcissistic, vacuous expression of like the West, of friggin' fashion magazine, and like they said, this works. This wins people over.
well, they
Like,
know their target demographic.
yeah, they know their target demographic, right? They know who's gonna relate to that, right? And it just kills me that that's what they opted for.
Well, I think the biggest
Uh,
shocker
um,
here is that Zelensky has a wife.
yeah, I know. Like, as one guy in one of my chats said, a rare W for Zelensky.
Look, if I were a
But
Jewish comedian, I could probably pull a pretty nice wife too, but that's
yeah,
beside the point.
yeah, they are capable of that. So I would say that you're already seeing a major shift towards China. And I don't think that's just to get like attention away from Ukraine. I think they kind of know people lose interest after a while if there's no quick victory. I mean, it is what it is, right? Um, but I think you know them trying to ramp things up in Taiwan is really something because for the Chinese point of view, right? China does not want another unsinkable carrier on its border. It already has one with Japan, and it does not want another one, particularly because, of course, the Japanese in World War II used Taiwan as a launch platform to take over huge areas of China, right? And that's another kind of humiliation. And I'm not saying we know what they're going to do or not do, but even if they don't do something now, they will do something later. They cannot let this go. And of course, the Americans want to do this in order to make the government look weak. Um, but um, the political situation in Taiwan is you've got one party that is pro-West and very pro-Japan, and you've got the other party of Chiang Kai-shek. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. And that party is for closer integration with China. And
Now talk about an irony there that the party
I
named
know,
after.
I know, right? And a lot of like Hong Kong bros and all that. I remember 2019 never mentioned that. Um, Granted, it was Hong Kong, but it's Taiwan. I think is very pertinent to Hong Kong in a slightly more enveloping conversation, let's say. about that region. Anyhow, the Western uh, political party, of course, won the last election, but only by a tiny bit, right? So, like, the reason that the Chinese were, didn't want or still don't want to invade Taiwan is because they clearly see a political solution, right? That this can be politically resolved. Um, so the Americans know that, and that's why they're also rushing there to provoke.
Yes, and as you brought up at earlier point in the show, Pelosi is taking a visit to Taiwan. Not with Biden, not with any real diplomatic delegation, just by herself, just taking her private jet to Taiwan, flanked by uh, a U.S. escort. That's the plan, at least. China has gotten so brazen. Well, I wouldn't even consider it brazen because it is right in their backyard. But China has um, gone as far as to threaten to down Pelosi and their escort if they
I
do
know.
visit Taiwan. Now, I doubt that will be the catalyst for a U.S. China war, but the rhetoric is certainly getting to the point where they are willing to make these threats. And again, this is just the kind of thing that you get. It does almost remind me, and perhaps this is just the state of the world right now, a threat that Kim Jong Un would make, a threat that would come out of
Yes,
North Korea. And
right.
I mean, perhaps it is the time
Great point.
for a country like China to play that sort of negotiation tactic. Now, that sort of rhetoric, just with the way Eastern Asian countries interact with each other, is nothing new. You can go back even during the best of times; they just make those outright brazen statements where they will just make those great threats. Again, North Korea is probably the biggest example of this for obvious reasons, but this isn't unheard of for China. This isn't unheard of for Japan, South Korea, etc., where this is the kind of rhetoric that they pull. But once again, Pelosi does feel the need to go over to go over to Taiwan and uh, bring this guarantee of support. Apparently, Republicans want to set up some sort of lend lease if conflict were to break out between China and Taiwan, that they want a way to funnel weapons to them. And that is on top of an American industrial base, which admitted it did not have the capacity to meet the needs that Ukraine had. That did not have the capacity to meet the aid requirements to Ukraine. And they want to make this guarantee to Taiwan. And upon the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, with very little U.S. effort to stop it, seemingly, many people thought that Taiwan would be the next domino to fall because they would lose confidence in the U.S., combined with
Mhm.
the pro Beijing elements on the island, which, as you said, only narrowly lost last election. So it does seem like there is some sort of negotiation that could be put forth. There is some sort of reconciliation politically that could be brought forth. This has been something that we've said on the show since the outbreak of the Hong Kong crisis, that
Mhm.
Taiwan will be next, but it likely won't be an outright invasion of the island because there's still enough sympathy to the point where China does feel like it could reconcile something, which I do believe that case. And as the
Mhm.
American empire begins to wane, as these stunts become either A, less common, or B, more ridiculous, the sympathies of Taiwan will go eastward, and especially as Western economic power declines and as China economic power presumably continues to rise, it's going to become a very easy choice for many people in the next few years. Not to mention, there probably is a significant chunk of the Taiwanese population that is split. They don't know whether they should seek closer cooperation with Beijing or seek a path of greater independence and alignment with the United States and the West. So I can only imagine there are some voices in the country that are just split down the middle that don't know what direction to go. Insofar as some sort of quote unquote civil war in Taiwan, I can't say for certain anything about that. From what I've seen, it would indicate that Taiwan, at least for the time being, wouldn't be given over to even a Ukraine style crisis where there is an armed faction uh, demanding integration with China or whatever. Now, I know the situations don't add up one to one, but point being is, in terms of internal violence in Taiwan, I don't really see it on the table for the time being.
Right, and I think China, I think, still wants it still wants just a political solution. It does not want a military solution. And yeah, so I guess we're going to have to see what and wait to see what happens. I mean, who knows? Will Pelosi land there? At the moment, uh, the Chinese were doing live fire drills at the Fujian district, and they've sent ships into the strait there. So they're up on the ante, and Xi Jinping has said to Biden, you have consistently said one thing and have done another, which is basically him saying you're a liar. And we saw ever since the Alaska summit that the Chinese are fed up with like woke lecturing. They're not going to listen to some nonsense about the Uyghurs uh, when there's like hundreds of them in Idlib province in Syria. Like they know what they're dealing with. So um, and that isn't to say that I'm not making the Chinese angels, but I'm just saying, uh, let's be realistic about this. It's it is big power politics. That's what's what's happening, and it's those kind of politics that do lead to wars, major wars that change the direction of history, and are also very tragic.
Well, that is all I had for today. If you have any other stories that we have forgotten last minute, I suppose now would be the time. If not, I will go ahead and wrap this up.
No, that is it for me.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into another episode of the War Report. I hope I wasn't too unbearable to listen to. I know I'm not at 100% yet, but I figured I'm well enough to do a show, and it's not like any of you can get convid digitally. At least I hope not. But you know what? Questions about a certain disease that uh, a lot of us, including myself, may have a great deal of skepticism about. Discussion for that has taken place, and it can take place at a different time. But thank you all for tuning in, and have a nice day.
Take care, guys.